Soldier On acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to traditional lands and waters and would like to pay respect to their elders, both past and present. Soldier On would also like to acknowledge the unique nature of military service and the valuable contribution made by former and current defence members and their families to our nation. Thank you to Oricon for generously providing the filming space for this episode. Content warning. The following episode may contain personal accounts of service, trauma, and mental health. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Saluting Their Service, Contemporary Voices of Bravery, a podcast which explores stories of veterans who have served and their journey beyond service and after their career in uniform. My name's Paul Singer, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Soldier On, and it's a great delight to be here for this episode with Nathan Schubert. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul.
Now, we're going to start with what life looked like before you entered the military. Can you just tell us where you grew up, what childhood was like, and then we'll explore what it is that attracted you to a career in the Royal Australian Air Force?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Cairns, far north, beautiful part of the world. I'd highly recommend it. And as a very young boy, I'd always wanted to fly. So I had that very fortunate early direction and kind of endpoint aspiration to work to. And I also had great support. My father was in the Navy for over 20 years, and I had my uncle in the Air Force as well. So I was able to kind of combine this aspiration for flying, which seemed like a fantastic idea. And also the Air Force has all these amazing aircraft to fly as well.
Yeah.
We weren't just looking at, moving from point A to point B, but how I could do that with more meaning to travel, see people, and also do it with a variety of like-minded individuals.
Can you recall the moment or the time or the experience when that love of flying feels as if you were first exposed to it?
I would say fortunately no, because it always seemed to be part of me.
Right.
Which is very lucky. But I was able to do a little bit of flying up in Cairns as well. They had a nice flying club there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also part of the Air Force cadets in school.
Okay.
So that gave me a little bit of a taste of what life in the services could be like.
Yeah.
But no, as far as my memory goes, I had a singular path and I was lucky enough to be able to follow that.
And what was that introduction to Air Force cadets like?
It was nice. So I was a schoolboy at the time, of course. So it was just a very different group of people and a different perspective that I hadn't seen before. The Air Force cadets gave me the opportunity to visit different Air Force bases and just go on different, I'd say like adventures at the time, whether that be out into the Cairns bushland or on a flight on a now retired Air Force Caribou, which was a journey in itself.
There are plenty of people, presumably a lot of people who are either listening to this or watching this who will have their own Caribou stories. What was the first time you flew in a Caribou?
Well, the first time I flew in it was just as a passenger down back, and true to form, the ramp opened to do a lap of Magnetic Island, and it didn't close back up because it had broken.
Oh, right.
So we were lucky enough to land in the Caribou with the ramp somewhat down.
Right. Wow. What an experience.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So how long were you with Air Force cadets for?
About 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So from mid-high school through to grade 12.
And you mentioned before that you had a family connection with both Navy and Air Force, but this was your first direct and personal connection with presumably with a hierarchical system, with an organised military unit. What did that feel like for you in those early days?
Yeah, it was obviously a slight change of pace, but it was something that I felt seemed fairly natural to settle into. It was clearly defined and the expectations were clearly projected. So I could understand what that framework looked like and then work my way through the years to see where I fit in. And then also it provided a nice kind of aim point because you could map out what your future in that organization might look like. So the structure for the hierarchy was very helpful from my perspective, and it very much helped me determine if I were to stay in an organization or join an organization like the Air Force, what that career might look like.
And when did that journey start to materialise for you?
So I had always aspired to join immediately after school. And from grade 10, looking at joining the Defence Academy after school to study, I started really to follow that ambition through the recruitment process. And it took about 2 years for recruitment to go through the various tests and interview screening processes to get through it. Lucky enough to receive a letter of offer in my third term of grade 12, which meant my Air Force journey would start through the Defence Academy in Canberra, and studying science was my chosen.
So you knew you wanted to be a pilot from relatively early on. Did you know what aircraft you wanted to fly?
I didn't. I knew it would be in the Air Force, though. I think there was an appeal of the fast jets flying because, as a schoolboy, like, they look amazing.
Yeah.
But there's drawbacks with each aircraft. So I was lucky enough through studying at the Defence College and then, of course, 2 years on pilot's course to be able to refine that understanding so that at the end of pilot's course, approaching graduation, you could put in preferences.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to get my first preference, which was C-17s.
Fantastic. So we'll come to that shortly. But what was the ADFA experience like at the Australian Defence Force Academy?
Yeah, the ADFA experience personally was great. I think my biggest takeaway was the amazing friendship group I formed there. So there's a dozen close mates who I'm still in contact with today. And I had coffee with one of them just yesterday. So that friendship circle's unbeatable. And it's something that I haven't seen as strongly represented through some of my schoolmates' experience at their universities. And also just the breadth of experience we got at ADFA. Certainly there was the academics, which you got to choose, and that aligned with the academic pursuit I wanted to follow. But in terms of the additional military training, adventure training at the time, I was able to go rock climbing at Mount Arapiles for a week in the semester break, which is just this beautiful part of the world. I'd highly recommend it if you can't get out there.
Wow. It is one of the wonderful products of the Australian Defence Force Academy, and indeed one of the reasons it was constructed is to bring university-age students together, but from each of the services, so that you can develop relationships from an Air Force perspective with university students from the Navy and from the Army. And those relationships last, don't they? Particularly those formed during those transformational experiences at such an impressionable age as you're going through university.
Yeah, it certainly is. And not only do they help me within my career in the Air Force, navigating postings, understanding what different career trajectories could look like, they've helped me after the Air Force as well. So not to jump too far ahead, but even the projects I've been working on now that are defence related, I've been able to reach back into those Navy, Army and Air Force colleagues almost as a sense check and to get a different perspective where we're able to add more value and I'm able to have a direct line to people with first-hand experience on those projects I'm working with, which ultimately benefits defence.
Absolutely. Being able to build up that network of a diverse range of contacts from across the services is something really rich and special, isn't it?
No, it certainly is. And internationally too.
Yes.
Exchanges, I was able to go to Indonesia and meet some aspiring pilots from the Indonesian Air Force as well.
Wow.
So, yeah, phenomenal opportunity, which I fondly look back on.
And I guess one of the difficult things, or something that some people find a challenge, is that you're in a university environment. The expectations around academic performance are there, and naturally so. But you're trying to balance that with a military career and your introduction to the military as well. Were there any times where you actually questioned whether this was the right pathway for you, or was it something that you always felt, I am doing what I knew I wanted to do?
Yeah, it was certainly moments of challenge like that. I think because I had a quite singular focus on flying at the time, there were moments where it felt like the additional military context that was layered on top of that didn't add immediate value to what I wanted from the future. But in hindsight, like those additional lessons, the leadership training, the external events sort of added to the richness and are so much more valuable than just the immediate focus on flying. So I completely agree. At the time, very challenging, and you're being pulled in all different directions. Yeah, but in hindsight, absolutely worth it.
Yeah. So you mentioned before you graduated and went off to pilot's course. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so pilot's course at the time was about 6 months in Tamworth, basic flying training school, and then 9 months in Perth at 2 flying training school. So the BFTS course was on CT4s. They're a single propeller, twin seat aircraft where you're sitting much closer than we are currently, which gave for some nice sort of intimate moments where you're sweating and struggling in the cockpit with your instructor right next to you judging you. And that was when the training really started to ramp up. It's a faster paced environment, and there's a lot of pressure that was self-assigned to pass because I had this aspiration to become a pilot, and that was the first roadblock to get through to continue on that journey. And unfortunately, the pass rates are difficult, so not everyone made it.
So you mentioned self-assigned pressure. Did it genuinely feel like you were putting that pressure on yourself, or was it part of the culture? Was it part of the expectations of flying school that there are only so many that pass what is a very challenging course? Where did you feel that pressure came from?
I think it was a bit of both. The culture we had as student pilots definitely assigned that, because there was this mentality that the only success you could get from that point was to pass and become a pilot. So there was a real sense of personal failure from people at that time who didn't make it, which, of course, in retrospect, is not justified, but that was the mindset we were living in. I think from the organisation, it was less of a pressure placed on us because they well understood that in any group there'd be different levels of achievement and different people may pass and may not. It just may not suit them at that time. So it was always understood to me to be a difficult balancing act between finding the level where you could pass someone safely against generating the required capability to get pilots for the Air Force. And where that line sits is always shifting. But of course, it's a safety first activity, so you never want to dip below what's safe.
And what was the tempo like? Talk us through what a normal day at flying school is like.
So after the initial ground school study, which is an intensive analysis of aircraft systems and rules, once you got settled into the flying routine, you'd typically have half the day dedicated to study. Then you'd have an hour flight somewhere in there, which would be preceded by a half-hour brief, a half-hour debrief, and you'd be flying for an hour. And what you did in the air would vary from flight to flight across the course of the 6-month period to eventually get more and more technical and complex, including low-level flying, map preparation, time on target flights, and then in the CT4, not an extremely capable aircraft, but there were some minimal aerobatics.
Right, okay. What was that like?
It was great.
What sort of aerobatics?
Small loops.
I'm thinking RAAF
spins.
roulettes. So that's my point of reference. So you need to either walk me back from that or give me a sort of comparison.
Never in the roulettes, so I wouldn't go that far. But the next school at 2FTS was when we jumped into the PC-9, and that was a much more performance-focused propeller aircraft. You would sit one in front of each, one behind one another, and that had twin ejection seats, fully aerobatically capable, inverted flying, formation, loops, spins. It was phenomenal.
Would it be?
And it was a much faster aircraft too. So that rate of progression that we had at basic flying training school just ramped up when we went over to Pierce, which is where 2 flying training school is.
So you've just spent this time in Tamworth. You've done this initial phase of your flight training. Where was your mind at? What were you thinking as you were making the transition from Tamworth across to Pierce?
Yeah, so at that point, I think almost everyone exclusively wanted to fly jets.
Right.
And there was a culture of pushing for that as the outcome because it's very much the pinnacle of flying within the military. It's by far the fastest, most complicated, and most competitive position to get into, but also the most rigorous and requires the highest level of performance. So between BFTS and 2FTS, my mind was thinking that would be the avenue I'd want to pursue. And then luckily we're able to refine that when we're at 2FTS to put preferences in.
And then I'm just thinking about the operational context that's happening at this time as well. So what year was it that you went across to Pierce?
So I went across to Pierce at the end of 2009.
Okay, so there's a high operational tempo in the Middle East at this time. There's a lot of activity over there. What influence did that operation have on you, your classmates, on your own preferences as to where you wanted to go after finishing the training?
Yeah, it was formative because at 2FTS we had greater exposure to military instructors, whereas at the time at BFTS they were civil instructors. 2FTS had military instructors with previous experience across different platforms and types. So being able to see that first-hand insight into what the role actually looked like, and then the role that each aircraft played around the world as well, was hugely valuable. Which I think is fantastic because throughout that 9-month period, I was able to see with each different platform how I could potentially have a greater impact on global events and also how to help people. So that was a great opportunity to refine my thinking. So at the end of that 9-month period, adjust my preferences and go, what I'd like to do and what's going to bring me more personal value in the long term was C-17s.
Right. So tell us about the thinking behind that.
So the thinking was a mixture between the professional reward and the personal trade-off too. There were greater opportunities for travel because the C-17 was very much a global aircraft. You'd be expected to fly all around the world into different environments and with less support. So you very much had a greater sense of responsibility to control the people and the aircraft with less backing than potentially other aircraft types might be. So that idea of being able to lead an aircraft and a group of people all throughout the world, almost autonomously, where your only call back home is when you've landed and after you've taken off to let them know everything's going well, was a little bit terrifying, but also like a challenge I wanted to follow. The impact in the Middle East, as you say, as well, was a big part because at that time, Australia hadn't had no plans to re-employ the jet aircraft in the Middle East too. So being able to contribute in a positive sense was a big determiner for me.
Was your decision a unique one, or were people still looking to head down the jet pathway, or were more people starting to think about other options as well?
I would say it's probably 50-50 at the end of 2FTS, and that ebbs and flows between courses based on the context of the world at the time. But I think about half-half, where half the course is still absolutely in love with almost the romance of flying jet aircraft, and the other half of the course have other ambitions which aren't so strictly tied to that core focus of flying.
And when was your first experience with the C-17?
Well, thankfully, post 2FTS, we were able to start conversion onto the C-17, and there is an extended period in the simulator before you actually get to the aircraft, which is good. But yeah, stepping into the cockpit of a C-17 after flying a tiny training aircraft was just something totally different.
I can't even begin to imagine. Had you ever flown in one before?
I'd never flown in one before, no.
So your first experience with the C-17 was stepping into the cockpit to fly it?
Yes, and you're 5 meters above the ground with a block of flats behind you that somehow gets airborne. It's
wow.
Yeah, a phenomenal experience, and you're somewhat dissociated from the extreme technology and inertia that's sitting behind you in that. And of course, that has its own challenges in adapting from what is essentially a sports car of a training aircraft to this monstrous military machinery of transport.
So how did you feel as you're walking out across the flight line, approaching this big beast of a thing, knowing that within minutes you're going to be responsible for flying this thing?
Yeah, it's inspiring to see that aircraft and to think, great, I can or I will have the skill set to pilot this one day. First time, very much not. It was a lot more nerves. And of course, as with all things, it's a structured training process. So at that point, my mind was probably trying to consider what the next quiz question was the instructor was going to ask me.
Well, I was going to ask, did you feel ready within yourself? Obviously, the system thinks you're ready and that you've passed through a very rigorous process to get you to this point. But you yourself, did you feel ready?
Yeah, I think that it's a sense almost of imposter syndrome there at every stage, where you understand, yes, you've done the training, and once you've passed that initial conversion, but you have a great support network in all of those aircraft. So the first time I was flying the C-17, it wasn't me solo at the controls. We had a qualified instructor next to me, ready and hyper alert, I'm sure, to take over at any moment. But then even on graduation, you'd graduate as a co-pilot. The captain would have controls and a senior captain as well at that. So it wasn't for 2 to 3 years of flying the C-17 across every mission profile you could think of that I graduated to being the captain of the aircraft. And then at that point, really had to reflect to think, gosh, am I the right person to be here now?
And what does that moment look like? What's that rites of passage through to being qualified as a captain look like? That actual moment when you qualify as a captain?
It's a extended test flight with an instructor, typically on a complex mission, which is not a training sortie. It's a real life mission to either move people or things globally. And the instructor will do his best to try and add a little bit of complexity into it. But with the joy of Air Force missions, that complexity normally sorts itself out and you just have to deal with it as you see it.
So can you tell us about that specific task that you were on when you became qualified?
A specific memory I have for that task was flying into Learmonth, actually. It was at night. One of the navigation aids were out. It was the end of a 3-day trip. We'd been internationally as well, and this was the final leg. So a lot of personal pressure. Learmonth itself is a smaller airfield in terms of major airports. And I was doing a non-precision approach as well, which is just, it was marginally more difficult than what you would do at a larger airfield. With that sense of pressure in the back of my mind that what is ostensibly a very simple procedure, my sort of whole career ambition of being a captain
rested
on that moment.
Yeah.
So huge relief to be able to, not by any means perfectly, but to be able to land that aircraft at that time and have the instructor at the time say, I'd trust my family to fly with you.
Which is a pretty glowing endorsement for anyone.
Yeah, which is a nice way of saying congratulations.
So immediately upon qualifying as an aircraft captain, which unit are you posted to?
So the C-17s were 36 Squadron at Amberley, just inland from Brisbane.
So this is where you're based?
That's where I'm based. Okay. And I spent 5 years there initially, straight off pilot's course in the Brisbane region, which is amazing. Like, it's a super base now, of course, but I had friends from pilot's course, not only at that unit, 36 Squadron, but also just across the road, flying the KC-30 aircraft, which was newly implemented as well. A very exciting time.
And what did those early years at Amberley look like for you then? What was the tempo like? What sort of notice were you getting before a particular mission? How much planning was involved? Were things becoming somewhat repetitive with some of the missions? You just talk us through what a sort of day in the life of a C-17 pilot at Amberley looks like.
Yeah. Well, a day in the life of a junior C-17 pilot very much looked like getting to work, assessing what your next trip would be, as they had a board which was public for everybody to see. And then you do deep preparation for that. So on one example where we did a training flight to New Zealand, a lot of low-level navigation preparation, making sure you're deep into the details of the maps, any potential obstacles, aerodromes, and then all the process points you need to achieve that. So from the mundane customs, for example, passports, you don't want to run afoul of another country on that front, but also then where might a telephone wire be? Like, where would power cables be? Is there an environmental protection zone that you have to avoid because it's a legal requirement? So you'd try to prep in advance of the flight to map out every possible sort of contingency that might happen, while also trying to have a bit of fun at the time.
So with something like that, how much preparation are we talking in terms of time? Is it hours, days, weeks?
For an international trip as a junior pilot, weeks, absolutely. Right. Of course, when you become more senior, it would turn into days. And it also depends on the complexity. Yes. So the other mission set that the C-17 immensely capable aircraft can do is airdrop. And that adds another layer of complexity again. You're then coordinating with whether it be Army, Navy, or Air Force personnel to understand what their requirements are, how high you'd like to drop out, working with airspace, whether it be domestic or international, to make sure that they have a clear path to drop into. And of course, whatever other training complexities they're working with.
So that mission planning takes up a lot of time, particularly in these early days as a junior pilot. Are there any particular experiences or missions that stand out as particularly strong memories?
Like, one of the most enjoyable memories was actually not on the C-17, but afterwards on a King Air, where we were flying through Papua New Guinea, and we had a small detachment in Papua New Guinea that we were we were working to help support an election. And the role was quite simple, to take the King Air, which is a small aircraft.
So this was a Papua New Guinean election?
A Papua New Guinean election. The
Australian Defence Force was supporting logistically. And
correct.
Okay.
Where our role was to fly into remote and austere airfields and meet locals who had often hiked a week through the jungle to collect ballot papers and then drop them off, so every one of their residents could have a vote in the upcoming Papua New Guinean election.
That's democracy in action, isn't it?
Which was wild. So to be able to see and have that first-hand interaction with the local remote villages, which otherwise wouldn't have been able to have a say in their own election, was fantastic and deeply meaningful. That's one of, my very best memories. For the C-17, to go back to your earlier question though, one of the more stressful moments was probably related to the Middle East. So we did a lot of profiles in the Middle East. And the one I'm thinking of was typical flight profile. We'd taken off out of a staging base. We were on our way into Baghdad, flying between a fairly narrow corridor of airspace, Saudi Arabia on our left, we had Iran on our right. It was at night time. We're about 10 minutes away from crossing the Iraq border. So we were deep into our checklists, putting on body armor, night vision goggles, getting ready to land. And unfortunately, one of the aircraft engines started to stutter, and a thunderstorm came up on our radar, which we were unable to avoid from the airspace restrictions we were dealing with.
Now, if I could just ask you to pause for a second, because I'm sure, like many listeners and watchers of this podcast, will be interested to know what a thunderstorm on a radar looks like. Because I've often wondered this as I've sat in an aircraft and we hear of either turbulence coming up and question, well, how is it that they can see it? So what does it look like on a radar?
On the C-17 radar, you would have literal colours, where light green meant it wasn't so bad, amber meant it could be a problem, red you wanted to avoid, and purple was very, very bad. So in terms of turbulence, it would be a radar return where it sensed significant movement from the previous return, was how it interpreted turbulence. And the thunderstorm itself was a pure moisture basing. So if we had a red radar paint, which we did in this case, we understood there was a huge amount of moisture, which is characterized at that height by a big thunderstorm.
Okay, so what happened?
Well, that was the pressure cooker moment where you had to rapidly work with the crew we had to understand, should we continue or should we turn around? And regardless of that, how do we do it safely? Because that's your priority. Luckily, in that case, we were able to resolve the engine issue. It was, thankfully, through some small troubleshooting measures, able to get back within the tolerances we needed. And for the thunderstorm itself, we maneuvered very so slightly to avoid the worst of it in a fairly 10 minutes. Like it's not a short period of time, but when you're trying to draw on the expertise of a diverse set of people, as we have on a crew on a C-17, it felt fairly time compressed. But thankfully, in the end, we were able to continue. We landed and successfully finished that mission.
And how much notice would clearly a very dynamic environment, meeting the national need and the operational tempo of what's happening on the ground in the Middle East. How much notice would you as a pilot and your crew get about the next mission?
Yeah, there was a bit of a split economy of notice, I'd say. You'd have your planned Middle East support flights, which were known months in advance. It was a very well publicised and understood re-support flight. But then there was also response to world events. And that could be as quick as you could pack your bag and get to the airport, as the C-17 and all our aircraft have a requirement to respond to emerging events.
And any particular examples from those short notice missions?
Well, one that stands out for me was actually flying to Europe, in fact, where Australia was responding to the MH17 disaster. So in a very short notice, Australia flew into the Netherlands, and then we spent about 3 weeks flying into and out of the Ukraine, repatriating those who'd passed away in the MH17 disaster. So that was another aspect that was incredibly impactful on my career within the Air Force, because the follow-on to that was from flying those Australian citizens from the Netherlands back to Australia and being able to draw on the skill sets that I'd created over the past 5 years flying to take off from Europe, land as an extended crew, fly through a small island atoll, and then eventually land back in Melbourne, noting that the families were going to meet you on arrival for a ramp ceremony. So once again, that close connection, seeing what you're doing is helping people, was very impactful and, yeah, a strong memory.
I have a slightly different perspective of that particular incident. I, through my previous role, was actually on the ground in the Netherlands when the first of the repatriation flights returned. And you wouldn't appreciate this from where you were sitting, but where I was sitting with those that were assembled on the tarmac to watch the first of those flights arrive in the Netherlands, there was this overwhelming sense of pride in seeing the C-17 with the Australian flag on the tail, knowing that the very best of our Australian Defence Force personnel represented the very best of Australian values in looking after those very horrific circumstances and doing so with great care and compassion. It was something that was both appreciated and acknowledged at the time. And I wonder how much of that weight sat with you and the crew in knowing what it is that you were doing and what it is that you were part of at the time.
I think there was definitely mixed reactions, of course. Whereas that, as you say, that emotion is overwhelming at the time. And I think it's very much exceeds anyone's normal experience, at least for me, for an event like that. So no, I agree. I'm not sure that we could sort of understand what that meant outside of the environment that we were flying in. And part of that at the time was just trying to maintain that focus of, here we have this mission to do, and it had its own complexities, of course, with where we were flying to and from. So to somewhat try and stay in this compartmented world of, let's do this job, let's do it to the best of our ability.
You, in a leadership role, have a responsibility to both yourself but also those you lead and your crew. So how is it that you were able to process that situation on a personal level, but also help the crew make sense of what it is that you were doing and the incredible role that you were playing as a crew at the time on behalf of not only those families, but the entire nation?
That's not something I think I could respond with any more insight, because I'm not sure I had that. It was just a focus of, we understand what we're doing is incredibly important. We understand that there's a huge spotlight on every flight that was happening at that time, both within Europe and also back home from Australia. So there's never, in my experience, been such direct reach down from the sort of defence executive command to want to know minute by minute updates for something. So we understood that pressure internally from defence. We understood the broader context, how we dealt with that ourselves and as a crew. I think the best we had at the time was just to literally discuss with each other, just to talk, check in, make sure everyone was as okay as they could be given the circumstance. And then where anyone needed more support, we could provide that ourselves.
And sometimes it's organic as that, isn't it? Just the very human, natural thing to do is just to check in with each other and to talk about things in a natural way to the extent that you can.
Yeah, and it was a complete contrast too from where we were in the world, particularly from the aircrew perspective, as to one day you had a day off, so you'd be trying to relax, having a coffee, and then the next day you'd be flying into these really testing circumstances. So managing that back and forth and sort of dissociation of where your mental headspace is at, I think is a challenge for any flight crew.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us to having returned back to Melbourne, having met some of the families, I understand. Is that right?
They met the aircraft on the ramp, yes.
Yes.
So we were asked not to meet the families directly for that period. However, they conducted the ramp ceremony, the arrival of those who'd passed away, off the back of the aircraft.
And then incredibly significant, poignant, important moment. Emotions are high for everyone. How is it that you then decompress and move on to the next thing?
I think there's a little bit of learned resilience from that almost elasticity of your mental state in those circumstances by that point. And you discuss with the crew, you check in on each other. And there was also a formal process from Defence when you landed back there. So check in with medical, and there was psychology support as well for those who needed it. But I think for most people, they were able to almost just put that to a side and say, that's something that we're able to support with, see what small positive they could from it, and then move on in a professional way.
Yeah. And again, I make the observation that from the outside looking in, it just seemed that those that were involved, and particularly the crews that were flying these very important missions, seemed to do so with great professionalism, but also equally with a known compassion. And I think that represented the best of Australian values in honouring those Australians in that terrible set of circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's the aspiration for those short notice missions. And for me, it was the culmination of all that training. As you say, that what can we achieve as a group to support Australia?
And you mentioned after the C-17s that you moved to King Airs. So what did that look like for you?
Yeah, so very fortunate finishing my C-17 posting that they were looking for some more experience on King Airs, and I was able to move up to Townsville, in fact, where the King Airs were based at the time, and take on a different role. Smaller aircraft, twin props, about 8 seats for everyone not familiar with a King Air, which is a big change from a C-17, and a different profile set too. Instead of being so focused on the sort of technical role of moving people and assets, this was slightly more in a mentorship role. So junior pilots off pilots course that potentially hadn't got their first preference may have gone to King Airs. Some had their first preference in King Airs. I was able to add a point of stability for a different point of experience and let them know what the broader Air Force was like, and that not everything was terrible on a King Air.
And you mentioned one of the missions in supporting the election in Papua New Guinea. But what sort of flying and what sort of missions were you supporting with the King Airs?
So from everything from people transport to light cargo and also mapping. I think the most interesting mission profiles we did moving people around was in support of the election. So whenever there's an election, you obviously have your VIP squadron, which do the primary role in the large aircraft. But if politicians ever needed to go to somewhere regional or remote, a King Air's the perfect aircraft for that.
So you'd supplement that effort.
So we could supplement that effort. And at that point, we went to Canberra for the period of the election.
And which election was this?
Yes, that was Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten.
Okay.
And we were able to base out of Canberra for an 8-week period. And we were on a short notice, daily changing schedule to follow the politicians to regional areas.
Now, I've spoken to quite a few pilots who have been involved in federal elections, and some of them love it. Others struggle with the short notice nature of some of the missions. And I've heard incredible stories of aircraft being in flight en route to a particular location, only to have that changed mid-flight. Do you have any stories that you want to share from the federal election?
You see both of it, and it's exciting to be a part of. You obviously have that pressure because you don't want to be seen in any way to be positively or negatively affecting an outcome, but rather just do your job. I think one flight we had where we're actually trying to fly into Newcastle with the deputy PM-to-be, and we weren't allowed to land because the jets at Newcastle wanted to do some flying display practice. Despite the full knowledge of the flight plans and not providing any advance notice, they delayed the politician by over an hour, which meant she missed her engagement, and we were given a bit of a slap on the wrist at the end of that. So it was always at the front and centre of our mind that you wanted to be able to provide a service without bias and also without telling the other pilots, because there was this constant fear that if information from one party went to another, they might change plans, short notice, and beat them to a scoop to make an announcement at a regional centre to swing the election.
I think one of the things that I'd observe is it's one of the many things that the Air Force do so well is supporting activities like this, which again are of great national significance, but in a thoroughly non-partisan way. And again, I think those crews that are involved in these sorts of exciting missions really thrive on the tempo, the excitement of it all. And it must have just been fantastic to be part of a King Air crew to support that nationally significant moment.
Yes. Yeah, it was very much my experience that maintaining that apolitical outlook was front and centre, almost to a fault. And while I loved being a part of it, loved getting to see a little bit behind the curtain into how politicians operated and how that world of the advisors, the potential politicians, the potential community engagements was manufactured and then displayed, and how that was received from the media was a great opportunity. Not great enough that I want to do it full time, but I enjoyed the experience.
Yeah, it must have been just fantastic to have been part of something like that. But again, that's only one of many experiences that you've already shared. So after the federal election, back to Townsville and continued with King Airs?
Yes. So I continued with King Airs for about a 5-year period. And towards the end of my King Air posting, I was lucky enough that Air Force were looking at integrating a new capability on the aircraft. And they were trying to mimic a US King Air capability, which expanded its profile set into a somewhat test intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance asset. So there was a nice Air Force minor project, which I was able to be a part of to integrate the new capabilities on the King Air. And that was my first insight into a project beyond just the core flying role. Required deep coordination with a variety of stakeholders and organizations, which weren't the typical pilot circle, and also gave me a little bit of a peek into the broader complexity of dealing with challenges in a highly regulated environment such as aviation.
So this obviously led to an itch that you needed to scratch, having been exposed to a different part of the Air Force, a project that you otherwise had not necessarily been part of. So what did that stir within you in terms of your own transition out of Air Force?
Yeah, exactly. It gave me that insight into something broader than just flying. I was lucky enough to do some study part-time while flying as well. So I did a Master of Systems Engineering to try and see if that work in an academic sense would align with what I find interesting. And I loved it. It seemed to be a nice blend of technical work, leaning on the crew resource management of flying a plane, but just applied differently. Instead of getting from A to B, you're trying to coordinate all the technical specialists to get a camera on an aircraft in this case. And I loved it. So that, for me, was the first point to go, what could this look like in a future career that I could define outside of defence?
And how many hours did you have flying at this stage?
I had, approaching the end of my King Air posting, I had about 10 years flying experience directly and over 3,000 hours piloting.
Right, okay. Wow, it's a lot.
So it was very much enough for me to be able to consider joining a commercial airliner if I was that way inclined. But the challenge which drew me to flying, of the technical movements, the airspace, the working in a team as a pilot, was being somewhat reduced at that point in my life. So I was motivated to see how I could continue working on those challenging problems that would keep me motivated for years to come.
Now, you're a child growing up wanting to be a pilot. You've accumulated over 3,000 hours of flying, incredibly complex and varied missions all around the world. How did the thought of a career beyond flying sit with you at that time?
Very challenging. I would say, because I had been so focused on this aspirational Air Force pilot image, that my own sense of identity was tightly intertwined with that. And the mere concept of leaving that didn't even seem like an option to me, despite not being in any contractual obligation within the Air Force. Just the mindset shift to understand that that could be an option took quite literally years for me to manage my brain around to get there. And I mean, at least for me, how I approached that and what helped me understand that broader perspective was in the conversations with people who had done it before. So I had, thankfully, some great colleagues who had left defence, who were able to give me some good insights into what they were doing now, and particularly for those who were former aircrew in those technical roles. So I had a lot of common ground. I knew they understood the mindset I was coming from, and I could also see that they were thriving professionally in their career after defence. So overcoming that kind of mental block was the first challenge for me getting out.
And when did you know that you'd made the decision to move on from flying and into a career post-Air Force?
So I think my final posting before getting out of the Air Force was into a headquarters squadron for the cargo aircraft, C-17 and KC-30. And the decision at that point would be to go back to C-17s and fly again, or it would have been to leave the Air Force. And at that time, newly married for myself, hoping to start a family, and the requirements of C-17s, which I understood, short notice, call-out times, being away from home for long periods of time, I didn't see would be aligned with my aspiration for being able to support a young child, for example, and provide some location stability to my family. So it was during that final posting where it solidified my mindset to understand I'd very much like to be able to provide that support for my family in a locational sense. And that was the decision where I went, okay, let's see what's available.
And what did that look like? What were you thinking at the time in terms of what the first role outside of Air Force might be?
I think the first role, which is the natural progression, if you think of a pilot in the Air Force, would be commercial flying. Obviously, you'll go to a major airliner, is what people might think. But after considering what I wanted from my future professional career, being able to support my family, not necessarily going away from home at short notice, the commercial flying lifestyle actually has those same restrictions as what flying in the Air Force would have. So with that ruled out, it was an open playing field and a bit more complicated. As I mentioned, I'd had some great conversations with colleagues who had left before me. I was able to refine what skill sets I had in the Air Force and I wanted to keep building on once I got out. So I had to understand what did I value, and that was working with aviation, always be a core part of who I am. Of course, the defense capability insight I have, but then where could I grow? And that, for me at least, is in the sort of commercial aspects, which was a little bit of a blind spot for me as a pilot in the Air Force.
And how did you translate the skills that you had accumulated through a very successful flying career with the Air Force into what that next opportunity might look like? How did you go about that process?
For me, it was all about the conversations with people I trusted, people who had left, and then those senior people in different organizations, just in a very casual sense, to understand what that might look like in their organization. So I approached defense prime aerospace manufacturers. I had some context through the Boeings, the Lockheed Martins of the world, as well as, which then led me on to a slightly broader professional service industry of professional consulting. And what I understood from those conversations was stepping into consulting could be an opportunity to work on those core areas I value, and to do so in a always changing, sometimes time compressed environment that would allow me to keep growing professionally.
So did you identify a job before leaving Air Force?
I identified a few jobs in the professional consulting services industry, and I was lucky enough to be able to apply and be accepted to positions as well.
Okay, and did you take any time between leaving Air Force and starting in a new role?
I didn't take any time. I took some long service leave between my final posting and starting, and that was to help with the job search.
Right.
So I took that long service leave to commit and get as deep into the details as I could manage.
Yeah. And what did that last day in uniform feel like?
The last day in uniform was a little surreal, of course. My entire professional life to that point had been in uniform, and it was very emotional.
Where were you?
So I was in headquarters 86 Wing, the headquarters for the cargo and aircraft in Amberley. And the commanding officer at the time gave me a nice farewell speech, shook my hand, and I gave an absolutely woeful thank you speech. I was just a bit overcome. It was lovely and a little bit sad, but with the prospect of a very happy professional future. It's just a lot of emotion, of course, tied up in that.
And it's you and your partner. Have you had your child by this stage?
No, so
it's just the two of you?
Just the two of us, recently married. And once I left the Air Force, moved to Sydney, my wife had a job opportunity here, and I was able to secure a position in a advisory firm where I'm currently working.
And we are very grateful to Oricon for hosting us here today. And it's now useful, I think, to talk about what that transition looked like for you and what your career post-service has involved. And let's start at day one. What was it like walking in here to the offices of Oricon?
It was nice. It was a change of my expectations from understanding what defence work looked like to coming to a day-to-day routine where every sort of 10th of an hour of your week is tracked. So there's an expectation within defence that you work, But within this organization, there's also accountability that every week you need to provide evidence of that. And if you're not providing that value to a client, the time won't be accepted. So you'll need to do additional work. So it was simultaneously there was more freedom from an individual perspective because you could work in a way that suited you, but also you needed to be able to produce results on a weekly basis to maintain it.
Which, of course, is nothing new for someone coming from military, producing results, being mission-orientated, outcomes-focused. But it must have been an extraordinary change of environment, of culture. Was that a jarring experience for you, or did you feel that you transitioned to this new environment fairly seamlessly? Was it a natural fit for you?
It was definitely a change of environment. Everyone would notice it. I think, having come from a career in the Air Force, to step into an office such as this one, in terms of the diversity, not only of people, but not everyone's in uniform, which might sound silly to people outside defence, but you're very much accustomed to that. Of course, when I left the Air Force, you weren't allowed beards at that time either. I know they've since changed it, but just seeing the sort of full spectrum of society in your workplace was a fascinating change in a professional work environment. In terms of the sort of hierarchy and culture, I think there were some parallels there. The Air Force and Defence has a very hierarchical system, which allows you to well understand what people's positions are. One of the biggest changes I noticed here is that you're not immediately afforded a position or a rank necessarily that someone can refer to you to. So it can be interesting in a conversation if you don't introduce yourself with a title. People don't have that immediate rank to look at on your shoulders to understand where do you fit into this world.
There's no immediate visual representation of who you are and where you fit in.
So it can be a much more sort of genuine interaction based on what value people bring in those settings.
So how was it that you were introduced to Aurecon? Did you have a sense of what Aurecon did? Had you had previous experience with them?
No, I had no sense of what they did prior to leaving. It was through my networking calls where I was trying to understand what different professional services firms might look like and how they work. I was very much focused on sort of big four accounting firms at that time. And in one of my calls with a colleague who had worked at Aurecon previously, he indicated I should reach out to examine Aurecon's work as well. So I was fortunate enough to be introduced to someone who worked here, and that conversation ultimately resulted in a position.
It's a great point, isn't it? Yeah, being prepared to have the conversation and to follow it to a potential lead, which might open you to something and to an opportunity that you otherwise may not have naturally thought of.
Absolutely. And I think it was hugely beneficial to me to have been able to define what I wanted from the work, the skills that I had, and how I could leverage those to get a position, so that I wasn't laser focused on a particular company, for example. But what was more important was, is the type of work aligned with what I'd like for my future?
And what were some of those skills that you thought were attractive to an organisation such as Aurecon? And more generally, what sort of skills do you think defence people bring to the corporate environment?
I think the core skills for me into Aurecon were initially the project management expertise, which I think everyone in defence has a great insight into. The follow-on would be team leadership, being able to work collaboratively with, have accountability for your actions, and be able to motivate people to achieve a common goal. I thought that was fantastic. And it's something that is not as strongly represented outside of the Defence Force as the training everyone in defence would be familiar with from their time in defence. And I think finally, it's the unique perspective. So in my case, it was very much centred on the aviation world, but the value people within defence can bring to these organisations is that they have unique subject matter knowledge and expertise in particular niches, which doesn't exist outside of that core role. So if they can take that knowledge, take their experience, and then leverage that to get a position with a company outside of defence, they're providing immediate immense value, which is a huge selling point for that company if they're trying to win work within that field.
Nathan, yours is a remarkable story. It's an incredible journey through your service career and now to your time here at Aurecon. There'll be many people who are listening and watching this with great interest and thinking about their own journey. Is there some advice that you would offer?
I would say if someone in defence is considering getting out, define your skills, consider how you could leverage that, and then do it. I completely recommend making those calls, getting in touch with the Veteran Network, and if anyone wants to reach out, I'm more than happy to have that chat.
Well, Nathan, thank you, and to all of the team here at Aurecon for hosting us here for this particular episode. It's been wonderful to sit here and converse with you and to listen to what's been a remarkable journey. And I thank you for your service and for sharing it with us today.
Thank you, Paul. This has been fun.
Well, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Contemporary Voices of Bravery. We look forward to you joining us for our next episode, where we'll look at another veteran and family member's journey after a career beyond service.
This podcast is proudly presented by Soldier On. Soldier On is a not-for-profit veteran support organisation delivering a range of services to enable serving and ex-serving veterans and their families to thrive. Should today's podcast elicit any personal concern, a list of support services can be found in our show notes. Saluting their service, Contemporary Voices of Bravery is a proud production of Art Videography and Soldier On. This podcast series was funded by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Thanks for listening.